This video is not about one lost city, one disaster, or one forgotten people. It is about 10 civilizations that once shaped the world, then faded so quietly that history almost forgot them. From the planned cities of the Indus Valley to the jungles of the Amazon, from stone temples in Crete, each chapter tells the story of human ambition, belief, and survival. We will explore how these societies rose, how they lived, and why they changed or disappeared. Some collapsed under climate pressure, some were reshaped by invasion, and others simply moved on, leaving their cities behind. Together, these stories reveal a deeper truth about civilization itself. Nothing truly vanishes, it only transforms. Let us begin this journey into the lost chapters of human history. Chapter 1. The Indus Valley Civilization. Long before the pyramids of Egypt were finished, and centuries before cities rose in Greece or Rome, another civilization quietly took shape along the rivers of South Asia. It did not announce itself with giant statues or royal tombs. It left no long-written histories carved in stone. And yet, when archaeologists finally uncovered it, they realized they were looking at one of the most organized urban societies the ancient world had ever seen. This is the Indus Valley Civilization. Its heart lay in what is now Pakistan and northwest India, along the Indus River and its ancient branches. Around 2600 BC, large cities began to appear across this region. Today, we call them places like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa. When these sites were first excavated in the early 20th century, they immediately challenged everything scholars thought they knew about early civilization. At first glance, the cities looked strangely modern. Streets were laid out in neat grids. Homes were built from standardized baked bricks, all made to the same proportions. Even small houses often had private wells and bathing areas. Beneath the streets ran covered drainage systems, carefully sloped to carry waste away from living spaces. In some places, inspection holes allowed the drains to be cleaned, showing long-term planning rather than quick construction. What is striking is how consistent this design was across hundreds of miles. Cities far apart followed the same building rules. Bricks were the same size. Streets followed similar patterns. This suggests shared knowledge and strong coordination. Yet, unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, there is no clear evidence of kings, palaces, or large royal tombs. No statues of rulers dominate public spaces. No inscriptions praise great conquerors. Power, if it existed in visible form, did not center on a single figure. Daily life in these cities appears practical and ordered. Archaeologists have found tools for farming, pottery for storage, beads made from stone and shell, and seals carved with animals and symbols. These seals are especially important. They suggest trade, ownership, or identity, and many have been found far from the Indus region, in places like Mesopotamia. This tells us the Indus people were part of long-distance trade networks, exchanging goods such as cotton, beads, and possibly food products. And yet the writing on these seals remains unreadable. The Indus script is short, usually just a few symbols long. No long texts have been found. Without bilingual inscriptions like the Rosetta Stone, scholars cannot translate it. This silence makes the civilization feel distant, even though its cities were advanced. Religion is another area filled with questions. Some seals show figures that may represent deities or ritual scenes. Certain bathing structures suggest water played a role in belief, perhaps linked to cleanliness or ceremony. But without texts, it is impossible to be sure. Unlike later cultures, there are no large temples clearly set apart from daily life. Belief seems woven quietly into the city, not displayed through massive monuments. For centuries, this system worked. Cities thrived, trade flowed, population grew. Then around 1900 BC, something began to change. Archaeological layers show signs of decline. Cities were not destroyed by fire or war. Instead, they were slowly abandoned. Buildings were repaired less carefully. Drainage systems fell into disuse. Populations shrank. Eventually, large urban centers were left behind entirely. For a long time, scholars searched for a dramatic explanation. Early theories blamed invasion. It was once suggested that invading groups destroyed the cities and replaced the population. But this idea does not match the evidence. There are no widespread signs of violent destruction, no mass graves, no burned layers across the region. Modern research has largely rejected invasion as the main cause. Instead, attention has turned to the environment. Climate studies show that the region experienced changes in rainfall patterns. Rivers shifted their courses. Some ancient river systems that once supported farming began to dry or move away from settled areas. If water became less reliable, agriculture would suffer, trade would slow, cities dependent on careful planning would struggle. Economic disruption likely followed. Long-distance trade depends on stability. When routes fail or partners disappear, urban systems weaken. Smaller communities may adapt more easily, but large cities are fragile. What seems most likely is not a sudden collapse, but a gradual transformation. People did not vanish, they moved. Populations shifted eastward, toward areas with more reliable rainfall. Urban life gave way to smaller settlements. Traditions changed, but did not end. This is what makes the Indus Valley civilization so mysterious. It did not fall in a single moment. It did not leave dramatic ruins of conquest. It simply faded from view. Chapter 2. The Mysterious Collapse of the Maya. For centuries, the Maya built cities that rose above the jungles of Mesoamerica like stone islands. Their temples climbed toward the sky. Their plazas echoed with ritual and ceremony. Their rulers carved their names into monuments, recording victories, alliances, and sacred dates with careful precision. By around 250 AD, this civilization had entered what historians now call the Classic Period, an age of growth, art, and political power stretching across what is now southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and parts of Honduras. Cities such as Tikal, Calakmul, Copan, and Palenque were not isolated places. They were connected through trade, diplomacy, and rivalry. Roads linked urban centers to farmland and smaller towns. Markets moved goods like jade, obsidian, cacao, and textiles. Kings ruled through lineage and ritual, claiming divine support through complex ceremonies tied to the calendar and the stars. The Maya recorded their world in stone. Hieroglyphs carved into stelae tell us the names of rulers, the dates of their births and deaths, and the wars they fought. This written record is one of the reasons the Maya collapse is so puzzling. Unlike other lost civilizations, the Maya left behind voices, and those voices do not describe an ending. For much of the Classic Period, the Maya world was busy and competitive. City-states rose and fell. Alliances shifted. Warfare was common, but it followed rules. Capturing rival nobles mattered more than destroying cities. Power was personal, tied to kings and their ability to perform rituals that kept the universe in balance. Then, in the late 8th century, the rhythm changed. Inscriptions that once appeared regularly began to slow. In some cities, the last dated monument was carved around 790 AD. Others continued slightly longer, but by 900 AD, most major southern lowland cities were silent. Palaces were abandoned. Temples fell into disrepair. Jungle plants began to reclaim plazas that had once been swept clean. What did not happen is just as important as what did. These cities were not burned to the ground. There is little evidence of sudden mass violence across the region. The collapse was not a single event. It unfolded unevenly, city by city, over decades. For a long time, scholars searched for one clear cause. Early explanations blame foreign invasion or moral decline. Modern research points instead to a combination of pressures, all acting at once. Climate records taken from lake sediments and cave formations show that the Maya lowlands experienced several prolonged droughts between 800 and 900 AD. These were not brief dry seasons. Some lasted decades. Rainfall dropped sharply during times when populations were at their highest. This mattered because Maya agriculture depended heavily on predictable rain. The region lacks large rivers like the Nile. Water was stored in reservoirs and managed carefully. When rain failed, crops failed. And when crops failed, cities struggled to feed their people. At the same time, deforestation worsened the problem. To build cities and farm large populations, the Maya cleared vast areas of forest. This changed local environments. Soil eroded, water retention decreased. The land became less resilient during drought. Political stress grew alongside environmental strain. Maya cities were locked in long-standing rivalries. War inscriptions increased toward the end of the Classic Period. As resources became scarce, conflict likely intensified. Kings who could no longer provide stability or food lost support. The very system that had once held cities together began to fracture. What makes this collapse especially complex is that it did not affect all Maya regions equally. Northern cities, such as those in the Yucatan Peninsula, continued to thrive after the southern lowlands declined. Places like Chichen Itza rose in importance. This tells us the Maya people did not vanish. They adapted. Villages continued. Farming continued. Traditions survived. What collapsed was a political model built around divine kingship and large urban centers in an environment that could no longer sustain them. Archaeology supports this view. In abandoned cities, signs of daily life linger. Tools were left behind. Homes were not emptied in panic. This suggests gradual departure rather than sudden flight. Families likely moved toward areas with better water access or joined smaller communities. The Maya collapse, then, was not the end of a people. It was the end of an era. The mystery lies in how such a sophisticated system, with writing, science, and deep cultural knowledge, could become so fragile when conditions changed. The answer is not simple. It rests in the balance between environment, population, and power. Chapter 3. Gobekli Tepe and the Forgotten Builders. Long before farming villages spread across the world, long before metal tools or written language, a group of people gathered on a hill in what is now southeastern Turkey and built something no one expected. They lifted massive stones, carved them with animals, and arranged them into circles with clear intention. Then, after centuries of use, they buried the entire place on purpose and walked away. This site is known today as Gobekli Tepe. It sits on a limestone ridge near the modern city of Şanlıurfa, overlooking a wide plain. For thousands of years, it looked like nothing more than a natural hill. Locals farmed the land. Stones lay scattered on the surface. No one imagined that beneath the soil rested one of the oldest monumental structures ever built by humans. The story of Gobekli Tepe's discovery begins in the 1960s, when a survey noted stone fragments in the area but dismissed them as medieval remains. The real breakthrough came in the 1990s when German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt revisited the site. As soon as excavations began, it became clear that this was something entirely different. What emerged from the ground were enormous T-shaped stone pillars, some weighing more than 10 tons. They were arranged in circular and oval enclosures, carefully set into stone sockets. At the center of each circle stood two taller pillars, facing one another. Their surfaces were smooth, worked with stone tools. Many were carved with reliefs of animals: foxes, snakes, wild boars, birds, and insects. Some pillars even showed abstract human features, like arms and hands folded across the front. These structures were dated to around 9,600 BC, more than 11,000 years ago. At that time, according to long-held theories, humans lived as small bands of hunter-gatherers. They moved with the seasons. They did not build large permanent structures. They did not organize massive labor projects. Civilization, it was believed, came later, after agriculture. Gobekli Tepe overturned that sequence. Here was clear evidence that people without farming, without pottery, and without metal tools had planned and built a complex ceremonial site. This required cooperation on a large scale. Stones had to be quarried, shaped, transported, and raised upright. Food had to be gathered to support workers. Knowledge had to be shared and preserved. In other words, social organization existed before agriculture, not after. The layout of Gobekli Tepe suggests it was not a settlement. There are no clear houses, no hearths for daily cooking, no trash layers typical of permanent living spaces. Instead, the site appears to have been a place people traveled to, possibly from many surrounding regions. A gathering place. This has led many researchers to interpret Gobekli Tepe as a ritual or ceremonial center. The animal carvings may represent symbols, clans, or stories important to the people who gathered there. The central pillars, larger and more carefully shaped, may represent ancestors, spirits, or abstract human forms. But without writing, interpretation remains cautious. What we can say with confidence is that the builders invested immense effort into meaning, not survival alone. Another striking detail is repetition. New stone circles were built over time, sometimes directly next to older ones. Each followed similar patterns but with variations. This suggests a long tradition passed down through generations. Knowledge did not vanish when one group left. It continued. Then something even more puzzling happened. Around 8,000 BC, Gobekli Tepe was deliberately buried. The enclosures were filled with rubble, stone fragments, and soil. This was not the result of abandonment and decay. It was intentional. The builders carefully packed the spaces, sealing the pillars underground. Then they left. Why would people bury something that took such effort to create? There is no single accepted answer. Some researchers suggest a shift in belief. Others point to changes in lifestyle. Around this time, agriculture began to appear in nearby regions. People started settling more permanently, focusing on fields and herds rather than seasonal gatherings. Gobekli Tepe may no longer have fit their world. What is important is that the site was not destroyed, it was preserved. By burying it, the builders protected the carvings from erosion for thousands of years. This act feels deliberate, even respectful. Another mystery lies in how little we have uncovered. Only a small portion of Gobekli Tepe has been excavated. Geophysical surveys suggest many more structures remain underground. Each could add new clues or new questions. We also know little about the people themselves. They left no graves clearly linked to the site, no personal items we can name, no stories written down. They exist through stone and silence. Gobekli Tepe forces us to rethink the origins of civilization. It suggests that shared belief and ritual may have brought people together before farming tied them to land. That meaning came before cities. That cooperation did not begin with kings or states, but with something deeper. Chapter 4. The Lost Cities of the Amazon. For a long time, the Amazon rainforest was treated as a place without a past. It was seen as too wild, too dense, too unforgiving to support large human societies. According to this view, people who lived there before European contact were small groups, moving often, leaving little behind. The jungle itself seemed to confirm this idea. Thick trees, tangled vines, and endless green appeared to erase everything over time. But this picture was wrong. The first hints came not from satellites or modern tools, but from words written centuries ago. Early European explorers traveling along the Amazon River in the 1500s described something unexpected. They wrote about large villages lining the riverbanks, wide roads, cultivated land, and dense populations. Some accounts spoke of towns stretching for miles. For a long time, historians dismissed these reports as exaggeration or fantasy. The rainforest, they believed, could not support such complexity. For generations, archaeology supported that doubt. Excavations were difficult. The soil was acidic. Organic materials decayed quickly. Stone architecture, common in other ancient civilizations, was rare. Without temples or pyramids rising above the trees, there seemed to be little proof. Then the ground began to speak. In the 20th century, researchers studying the Amazon noticed unusual patterns in the soil. Patches of dark, fertile earth appeared in places where the surrounding soil was poor. This soil, known today as terra preta, was not natural. It was created by humans through the careful mixing of charcoal, food waste, and organic material. It remained fertile for centuries. This alone suggested long-term settlement and environmental knowledge. As research continued, more signs emerged. Raised fields appeared in flood-prone regions, designed to drain excess water and protect crops. Fish weirs and canals showed controlled use of rivers. In some areas, straight lines and geometric shapes were visible from the air, cutting through the forest in ways nature does not. The real breakthrough came with modern technology. Satellite imagery and airborne laser scanning, known as LIDAR, allowed researchers to see through the forest canopy. What they found changed everything. Beneath the trees were vast earthworks, large circular and rectangular enclosures, long straight roads, causeways connecting settlements, and carefully planned landscapes. These were not random. They were designed. In regions of Brazil, Bolivia, and Peru, archaeologists identified networks of towns connected by roads, surrounded by managed forest rather than untouched wilderness. Trees that provided food, medicine, or materials were encouraged to grow. Others were cleared. The forest itself had been shaped by human hands. This meant the Amazon was not a pristine wilderness before European contact. It was a cultural landscape. Estimates began to shift. Instead of a few scattered tribes, researchers now believe millions of people may have lived across the Amazon basin before the 16th century. Their societies did not rely on stone cities or massive monuments. They relied on knowledge of plants, water, and soil. Their architecture was often made of earth and wood, materials that vanish quickly once abandoned. Which brings us to the central mystery. If these societies were so widespread and organized, why did they disappear so completely? The answer appears to lie in timing. When Europeans arrived in the Americas, they did not come alone. They brought diseases such as smallpox, measles, and influenza. Indigenous populations had no immunity. In many regions, disease spread faster than explorers themselves. Entire communities collapsed before they were ever recorded. In the Amazon, this impact would have been devastating. Large connected populations meant faster transmission. Leadership structures failed. Knowledge networks broke. Fields went untended. Roads fell apart. Within a few generations, forests reclaimed cleared land. Earthworks softened. Villages vanished beneath leaves and roots. By the time later explorers returned, the people were gone, and the forest looked ancient and untouched. This explains why early reports seemed unbelievable. The observers described a world that no longer existed by the time others arrived to verify it. The collapse was swift, silent, and almost complete. What remains today are fragments, raised mounds barely visible from the ground, lines that only make sense from above, soil that remembers what trees have forgotten. The lost cities of the Amazon challenge how we define civilization. They show that complexity does not always mean stone walls or written records. It can mean balance with nature, long-term planning, and deep environmental knowledge. These societies did not vanish because they failed. They vanished because they were exposed suddenly to forces they could not survive. Chapter 5. The Sea Peoples and the Bronze Age Collapse. Around 1200 BC, the ancient world entered a period of shock that no one at the time could fully explain. Powerful kingdoms that had ruled for centuries began to fail within a single generation. Cities were burned, palaces were abandoned, trade routes that connected distant lands went silent. The Bronze Age, a world built on careful balance and long-distance exchange, began to unravel. At the center of this collapse appears a name carved into stone by desperate rulers: the Sea Peoples. They do not come to us through their own words. They left no cities we can clearly name, no written records we can read. Instead, we know them through the fear they caused. Egyptian inscriptions describe waves of attackers arriving by land and sea, bringing families, weapons, and carts, not just armies. These were not simple raids. They were movements of people. By the late 13th century BC, the Eastern Mediterranean was tightly connected. The Hittite Empire ruled much of Anatolia. Mycenaean kings controlled strongholds in Greece. Egypt held influence along the Levant. Copper from Cyprus, tin from distant regions, grain, textiles, and luxury goods moved constantly between these powers. Bronze, the metal that defined the age, depended on this system. If one link broke, many others followed. Then the links began to fail. Archaeological layers from this period tell a clear story of destruction. At sites like Hattusa, the Hittite capital, buildings were burned and never rebuilt. Mycenaean palaces such as Pylos and Mycenae show signs of fire and sudden abandonment. Cities along the Levantine coast were destroyed one after another. Trade goods disappeared from the record. Writing systems fell out of use. Egypt unusually survived. But even Egypt was shaken. During the reign of Ramesses III, around 1177 BC, Egyptian texts describe a major crisis. Inscriptions at Medinet Habu show foreign groups attacking Egypt by land and sea. The text lists names such as the Peliset, Cheker, Shekelesh, and Dinyan. These groups are what modern scholars call the Sea Peoples. The reliefs show ships packed with fighters and families, ox carts moving inland, and battles fought desperately along the Nile Delta. Ramesses III claimed victory. He said Egypt repelled the invasion and restored order. And in a narrow sense, he was right. Egypt was not destroyed, but even Egypt emerged weakened, struggling with internal problems and economic strain in the years that followed. The question that still shapes this mystery is simple but unsettling. Who were the Sea Peoples, and why did they appear everywhere at once? For a long time, they were described as pirates or raiders, sudden attackers who brought chaos. But the evidence suggests something more complex. The scenes show migration as much as warfare. Families traveled with the fighters. This suggests people on the move, not just armies seeking loot. One leading explanation focuses on climate stress. Scientific studies of pollen, lake sediments, and ice cores point to a period of prolonged drought across much of the eastern Mediterranean around this time. Crops failed, food shortages spread. Societies already under pressure may have been forced to move in search of better land. Earthquakes may have played a role as well. Many cities sit on fault lines, and archaeological damage patterns in some regions match seismic activity. Repeated earthquakes could weaken urban centers, making them easier targets or causing people to abandon them entirely. Warfare added to the strain. As resources became scarce, conflict increased. Smaller states fought over what remained. Large empires, dependent on steady tribute and trade, could not adapt quickly. Their strength became a weakness. What makes the Bronze Age collapse so striking is how interconnected failure was. The Hittites depended on trade routes that crossed regions now in chaos. Mycenaean palaces relied on centralized control and record-keeping. When communication broke down, these systems collapsed rapidly. Once bronze production failed due to tin shortages, military and agricultural tools suffered. Recovery became harder with each loss. And then there is the final mystery. After reshaping the ancient world, the sea peoples themselves vanished from history. Some groups may have settled. The Peliset, for example, are often linked to the Philistines of later biblical texts. Others disappear entirely. They do not form new empires. They leave no clear legacy under their own names. This suggests that the sea peoples were not a single civilization, but a symptom of collapse. They were made of displaced groups, survivors of broken systems, moving through a world that could no longer support them as it once had. The Bronze Age did not end because of one enemy or one disaster. It ended because a complex world lost its balance. Once lost, it could not be quickly restored. Chapter 6. Cahokia and North America's Lost City. Long before European explorers reached the Mississippi River, a city rose on its eastern banks that would become the largest urban center in North America north of Mexico. It had no stone walls, no written language carved into monuments, and no surviving royal names. And yet, at its height, it was home to tens of thousands of people. This city was Cahokia. Today, Cahokia lies near modern-day St. Louis, spread across what now looks like quiet grassland. For a long time, the low hills scattered across the area were mistaken for natural rises in the land. Farmers plowed around them. Roads cut through them. It was only in the 19th and 20th centuries that researchers began to understand what they were seeing. These were not hills. They were mounds built by human hands. At its peak, around 1050 to 1200 AD, Cahokia covered more than 5 square miles and contained over 100 earthen mounds. The largest, now called Monk's Mound, rose higher than a 10-story building. Its flat top held large wooden structures, likely used for ritual or leadership. From its summit, one could see the entire city laid out below. Cahokia did not grow slowly over centuries. Archaeological evidence suggests a sudden population boom around the year 1050 AD. In a short time, thousands of people moved into the area. Homes were built, fields were cleared, mounds were raised layer by layer using baskets of earth carried by hand. This kind of rapid growth required planning, authority, and shared belief. The city was carefully organized. Residential areas were arranged around open plazas. Mounds varied in size and function. Some were burial sites, others supported important buildings. The largest mounds were placed near central plazas, suggesting they held special meaning. Wooden palisades were built and rebuilt multiple times, indicating both protection and symbolic boundaries. Trade connected Cahokia to a vast network. Archaeologists have found materials from far beyond the Mississippi Valley. Copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the Gulf Coast, mica from the Appalachian Mountains, and stone tools made from distant quarries all appear at the site. These items were not everyday objects. Many were used in ritual or display, suggesting that Cahokia played a central role in religious and political exchange. This brings us to the question of power. Cahokia shows clear signs of social hierarchy. Not everyone lived the same way or was buried the same way. Some graves contain rich offerings, while others are simple. One burial mound revealed a central figure laid on a bed of shell beads, surrounded by others placed carefully around him. This suggests a leader, possibly a ruler with religious authority. Many scholars believe Cahokia was governed by a system where spiritual power and political leadership were closely linked. The city's layout aligns with solar events. Wooden posts, sometimes called wood henges, were arranged in circles and used to mark solstices and equinoxes. These structures show that astronomy mattered. Time, seasons, and the movement of the sun likely played a role in ritual and governance. For the people of Cahokia, farming was the foundation of life. Corn was the primary crop, along with beans and squash. This agricultural system could support large populations, but it also carried risk. Corn farming requires careful soil management. Over time, heavy use can reduce fertility. As the population grew, pressure on the land increased. Forests were cleared for fields and construction. Soil erosion followed. At the same time, the Mississippi River posed a constant threat. Flooding could destroy crops and homes. Evidence from soil layers suggests that floods became more frequent or severe during Cahokia's later years. By around 1200 AD, signs of stress appear in the archaeological record. Construction slowed. Some neighborhoods were abandoned. Defensive walls were rebuilt more often, hinting at unrest. Diets changed, suggesting food shortages. The city that had grown so quickly now struggled to maintain itself. Then around 1350 AD, Cahokia was largely abandoned. There is no clear sign of invasion, no widespread burning, no sudden mass death. Like many lost cities, Cahokia did not fall in a single dramatic moment. It emptied out over time. People left, likely in waves, moving to smaller communities in the surrounding region. Environmental strain offers part of the explanation. Flooding, soil exhaustion, and climate shifts would have made large-scale urban life difficult. But environment alone does not tell the full story. Social and political systems also matter. If leadership lost legitimacy, or if rituals failed to bring expected results, people may have chosen to leave. Cahokia's story challenges old assumptions about North American history. It shows that large, complex cities existed long before European contact. It shows that power, belief, and trade shaped societies in ways comparable to other ancient civilizations, even without stone architecture or writing. And like many lost cities, Cahokia did not truly vanish. Its people carried their traditions with them. Later Native American cultures in the region show connections in art, belief, and social structure. The city disappeared, but the culture endured. Chapter 7. The Minoans of Crete. Long before classical Greece took shape, an island civilization ruled the seas of the eastern Mediterranean. It did not build massive walls around its cities. It did not celebrate war in its art. Instead, it painted dolphins on palace walls, filled rooms with color, and moved goods across the sea with confidence. This was the Minoan civilization, centered on the island of Crete. For centuries, the Minoans were largely forgotten. Their cities lay buried beneath later ruins, their language unreadable, their history silent. It was only in the early 20th century that this lost world began to surface again. At Knossos, a sprawling complex emerged from the soil, unlike anything seen before in the ancient world. It was not a fortress or a temple in the usual sense. It was a palace, but also a city within a city. Knossos revealed a place of movement and flow. Corridors twisted and turned. Staircases rose and fell across multiple levels. Light wells brought sun deep into the building. Walls were covered in frescoes showing people dancing, leaping over bulls, and moving freely through open spaces. There were storerooms packed with large clay jars for oil, wine, and grain. This was a center of power, but not one defined by fear. Similar complexes appeared across Crete at sites like Phaistos, Malea, and Zakros. Together, they suggest a network of regional centers rather than a single capital. These palaces were carefully planned, rebuilt after disasters, and expanded over time. Their layout hints at administration, ritual, and storage, all combined into one place. The sea was central to Minoan life. Crete sits between mainland Greece, Anatolia, and Egypt, perfectly placed for trade. Archaeological finds show Minoan pottery and goods reaching distant shores. In return, raw materials and ideas flowed back to the island. Ships were not just tools of commerce, they were symbols of identity. Minoan art reflects this outlook. Frescoes show waves, fish, and marine life. Human figures appear active and expressive, often painted in motion. Unlike later Greek art, there is little focus on battle or conquest. This has led many scholars to suggest that the Minoans relied more on naval power and trade than on armies. But art alone cannot tell us how society truly worked. What we do know is that Minoan culture was highly organized. Writing existed in the form of symbols known today as linear A. It appears on tablets and vessels, likely used for administration. But despite decades of effort, linear A remains undeciphered. Without it, we lack direct voices from the Minoans themselves. Their beliefs, laws, and stories remain out of reach. Religion seems to have played a strong role in daily life. Figurines show women holding snakes, standing on mountain peaks, or raising their arms in ritual poses. Shrines appear in caves, on hilltops, and within palaces. This suggests a belief system closely tied to nature and place. Women appear prominently in religious imagery, though what this means for social structure is still debated. For a long time, the Minoans appeared to thrive. Their cities were rebuilt after earthquakes, showing resilience. Their trade networks remained strong. But beneath this stability, forces were gathering. Crete lies in a seismically active region. Earthquakes struck the island repeatedly. Archaeological layers show cycles of destruction and rebuilding. The Minoans adapted to this reality, designing buildings with features that reduce collapse. Still, each disaster would have tested resources and leadership. Then around 1600 BC, a much larger event occurred. On the nearby island of Thera, now called Santorini, a massive volcanic eruption shook the region. It was one of the largest eruptions in human history. Ash fell across wide areas. Tsunamis likely struck coastlines. While Crete was not destroyed outright, coastal settlements may have suffered heavy damage. Trade routes would have been disrupted. Agriculture may have been affected. For years, scholars debated whether this eruption caused the end of Minoan civilization. Today, most agree it was not the sole cause. Minoan centers continued to function afterward, but the eruption likely weakened the system, making it more vulnerable to later change. That change came from the north. By the 15th century BC, signs of Mycenaean influence appear on Crete. New styles of pottery emerge. Linear B, an early form of Greek writing, replaces linear A in administrative contexts. This suggests that Mycenaean elites took control of key centers, including Knossos. The transition does not look like total destruction. It looks like takeover. What remains unclear is how this shift happened. Was it a military conquest? A gradual assumption of power after disasters weakened local leadership? The archaeological record offers clues but no clear answer. By around 1400 BC, the distinctive Minoan culture that had dominated Crete for centuries was fading. Palaces were abandoned or repurposed. Art styles changed. Writing changed. The people remained, but their identity transformed. The mystery of the Minoans is not just why they fell, but why they left so little behind that speaks clearly. No historical records name their rulers. Their language remains silent. Their end blends into another culture without a clear break. Chapter 8. The Ancestral Puebloans. Long before Europeans crossed the Atlantic, a network of stone communities rose across the high deserts and canyons of the American Southwest. They were built into cliffs, aligned with the sun and stars, and connected by roads that stretched across empty land. For centuries, these places were full of life. Then by around 1300 AD, many of them were quietly left behind. These people are known today as the Ancestral Puebloans. Their world covered parts of what is now Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah. The land was harsh, rain was rare, summers were hot, winters cold, and yet the Ancestral Puebloans built long-lasting communities here, using stone, mud, and deep knowledge of the environment. One of the most important centers of this world was Chaco Canyon, located in present-day New Mexico. At first glance, the canyon feels remote and empty, but between about 850 and 1150 AD, it was the heart of something much larger. Massive stone buildings rose from the canyon floor, some reaching 5 stories high. These were not small homes. They were great houses, carefully planned and precisely built. Chaco Canyon stands out because of its scale and order. The stones used in construction were shaped and placed with care. Walls were straight, corners were sharp. Many buildings were aligned with solar events, such as solstices and equinoxes. Light and shadow were used to mark time, showing that astronomy played a role in planning and belief. Roads extended outward from Chaco in straight lines, cutting across the desert toward distant communities. Some were over 30 feet wide. These roads did not always lead to obvious destinations, which has puzzled researchers for decades. They may have served ritual purposes, or symbolized connections between places rather than simple travel routes. Trade linked Chaco Canyon to faraway regions. Archaeologists have found turquoise, shells from the Pacific coast, copper bells from Mexico, and cacao residues from Mesoamerica. These were not everyday items. They were rare and meaningful, likely tied to ceremony and status. This tells us that the Ancestral Puebloans were part of long-distance exchange networks that crossed cultural boundaries. Life in these communities required careful balance. Corn, beans, and squash formed the base of the diet. Farming depended on seasonal rains and knowledge of local soil. Water was managed through small channels and reservoirs. Every resource mattered. For generations, the system worked. Then the climate began to change. Tree ring studies, one of the most reliable tools for understanding past climate in this region, show that the late 12th and 13th centuries brought prolonged droughts. These were not short dry spells. Some lasted decades. Rainfall dropped. Crops failed more often. Food became harder to store and share. At the same time, populations had grown. More people meant more pressure on land, wood, and water. Forests near major sites were cut down for fuel and construction. Evidence suggests that timber had to be brought from farther and farther away. This increased effort and strain on communities. Social changes appear in the archaeological record as well. Construction at Chaco slowed after 1150 AD. Some great houses were left unfinished. Others show signs of remodeling, suggesting shifting use or authority. In later sites, defensive structures become more common, hinting at rising tension. By around 1300 AD, many of the largest settlements, including cliff dwellings like those at Mesa Verde, were abandoned. Homes were left intact. Tools and pottery remained behind. This suggests people did not flee suddenly. They left with purpose. The key question is why. One explanation is collapse. Climate stress, combined with limited resources and social strain, may have made large centralized communities impossible to sustain. Without enough food or stability, people would have needed to move. Another explanation is migration rather than collapse. Oral histories from modern Pueblo peoples describe long journeys, guided by tradition and belief. From this perspective, leaving was not failure. It was part of a planned transition. Communities reorganized, moving south and east to areas with more reliable water. What is clear is that the ancestral Puebloans did not disappear. Their descendants live on today in Pueblo communities across the Southwest. Languages, rituals, and knowledge survived, even as stone cities were left behind. The mystery lies in how such complex centers, once so carefully built and connected, could be set aside. Whether driven by drought, social change, or spiritual decision, the abandonment marked the end of one way of life and the beginning of another. Chapter 9. Angkor and the Khmer Empire. For centuries, Angkor stood at the center of a world built on water. From the 9th to the 15th century, the Khmer Empire ruled much of Southeast Asia, and its capital grew into the largest pre-industrial city on Earth. Dense forests, rice fields, temples, canals, and reservoirs stretched across hundreds of square kilometers. From above, Angkor was not just a city, it was an engineered landscape. At its heart rose stone temples that still define Cambodia today. Angkor Wat, Angkor Thom, Bayon, Ta Prohm. These structures were not isolated monuments. They were part of a living system that tied religion, power, and environment together. Kings ruled not only as political leaders, but as guardians of balance between heaven and earth. Angkor's success depended on water. The region experiences strong seasonal change. Heavy monsoon rains arrive for part of the year, followed by long dry months. To survive and thrive, the Khmer developed one of the most complex water management systems in ancient history. Massive reservoirs called barays were dug to store rainwater. Canals carried water across the plain, feeding rice fields and stabilizing supply through dry seasons. Smaller channels linked neighborhoods, temples, and farmland. This system allowed Angkor to support a population estimated in the hundreds of thousands, possibly more than 1 million at its peak. Rice harvests were reliable. Surplus food supported craftsmen, priests, soldiers, and administrators. The city expanded outward, not upward, blending urban life with agriculture. Religion shaped everything. Khmer kings followed Hindu and later Buddhist traditions, presenting themselves as divine rulers connected to cosmic order. Temples were designed as symbolic mountains, representing the center of the universe. Angkor Wat, built in the early 12th century, reflected this vision perfectly, with its towers rising like sacred peaks and its walls covered in carved stories of gods and kings. Inscriptions carved into stone tell us about temple donations, land grants, and royal authority. They record kings founding new monuments, honoring deities, and organizing labor. These texts show confidence and control. Angkor was not a fragile city. It was the result of centuries of planning and adaptation. But even the strongest systems have limits. In recent decades, archaeologists using satellite imagery and ground surveys began to see Angkor differently. Beneath the trees lay traces of neighborhoods, roads, ponds, and canals far beyond the visible temples. This confirmed that Angkor's scale was far larger than once believed. It also revealed something else. The water system was not static. It was modified again and again, expanded, repaired, and rerouted as the city grew. This constant change made the system powerful, but also vulnerable. Climate studies using tree rings and sediment cores show that Southeast Asia experienced periods of severe climate instability in the 14th and 15th centuries. There were years of intense monsoon rains, followed by long droughts. Floods damaged canals, sediment clogged reservoirs. Dry seasons drained stored water faster than expected. A system built for balance struggled with extremes. Archaeological evidence shows signs of stress. Some canals were abandoned. Others were hastily modified. In certain areas, water flow became uneven, causing flooding in some zones and shortages in others. Once parts of the system failed, pressure increased elsewhere. Repairs required labor, coordination, and authority. At the same time, Angkor faced political challenges. Power within the empire shifted. New elites rose. Religious focus changed as Theravada Buddhism spread, emphasizing local temples and monastic communities rather than massive state-sponsored monuments. This altered how resources were used and where loyalty flowed. Foreign pressure also grew. Neighboring states challenged Khmer control. Trade routes shifted toward coastal centers, reducing Angkor's importance as an inland capital. The city was not suddenly conquered. Instead, it slowly lost its central role. By the early 15th century, royal courts began spending more time away from Angkor. Administrative focus moved south. Temples were still visited. Farmers still worked the land. But the city as a unified center was fading. What makes Angkor's story unusual is how quiet this process was. There is no clear destruction layer marking the end. No single invasion that erased the city. Angkor was not burned to the ground. It was left behind gradually. Forests grew back over canals. Wooden houses decayed. Stone temples remained, silent witnesses to a system that no longer functioned as it once had. The mystery of Angkor is not why it fell suddenly, but why such a sophisticated city could not adapt to change fast enough. It had solved water management better than almost any ancient civilization. Yet when climate became unpredictable, that strength became a weakness. Angkor reminds us that scale itself can be fragile. The larger and more complex a system becomes, the harder it is to repair when conditions shift. Chapter 10. Rapa Nui and the Mystery of Easter Island. Far out in the Pacific Ocean, more than 2,000 miles from the nearest continent, lies one of the most isolated inhabited places on Earth. To sailors approaching it for the first time, it must have seemed impossible that anyone could live there at all. And yet for centuries, a small society not only survived on this remote island, but reshaped it in one of the most striking ways ever recorded. This place is Rapa Nui, often called Easter Island. Its fame comes from the Moai, massive stone statues carved from volcanic rock, some weighing more than 70 tons. They stand along the coast, facing inland, their long faces calm and watchful. When European explorers arrived in the 18th century, many of these statues were already toppled. The society that built them was struggling. For a long time, this led to a simple and dramatic story. The people destroyed their own environment and collapsed. Modern research tells a more careful story. The ancestors of the Rapa Nui people likely arrived on the island around 1200 AD, sailing thousands of miles across open ocean using canoes and deep knowledge of stars, currents, and wind. This alone speaks to a high level of skill and organization. When they arrived, the island was different from what we see today. It was covered in forests, including large palm trees found nowhere else on Earth. Birds nested in great numbers. The land offered resources, but only if they were carefully managed. Over time, the population grew. Villages formed along the coast. Fields were created using stone mulch to protect crops from wind and dry soil. Fresh water was limited, often coming from underground seepage near the shore rather than rivers. Life required constant attention to balance. Somewhere in this developing society, the tradition of carving moai began. The statues were carved from a volcanic crater called Rano Raraku, which still holds hundreds of unfinished figures. Archaeologists studying the site can trace the process step by step. Stone tools were used to carve the statues directly from the rock face. Details were added while the statue lay attached to the stone. Then it was cut free. Moving the moai was once thought to require large wooden sleds or rollers, implying massive deforestation. Experiments and research over the last few decades have shown another possibility. Using ropes and coordinated movement, teams could walk the statues upright, rocking them side to side. Oral traditions from the island support this idea. The statues were not dragged, they were guided. This matters because it changes how we understand the island's environmental history. Earlier theories claimed the Rapa Nui cut down all their trees to move statues, leading to soil loss, famine, and collapse. While deforestation did occur, modern evidence suggests the process was more complex. Climate shifts, the introduction of rats that ate seeds, and gradual land use all played roles. It was not a single act of destruction. The moai themselves were not just art. They represented ancestors. Their placement mattered. They stood on stone platforms called ahu, aligned with villages. Facing inland, they were meant to watch over the living, offering protection and authority. Building and raising a moai was likely a communal act, tied to status, belief, and memory. For centuries, this system worked. Then change came. By the time Europeans first made contact in 1722, the island's society had already shifted. Many statues were toppled. Authority structures had changed. Oral histories describe conflict between groups, but not total collapse. Life continued, though under strain. European contact made everything worse. Disease arrived quickly. Population dropped sharply. Later visitors brought slave raids and forced removals in the 19th century. Missionaries altered belief systems. Colonial rule restricted land use. These events did more damage in a few decades than centuries of isolation ever did. This is why modern researchers urge caution when telling Rapa Nui's story. The island did face environmental limits. It did experience social change and conflict, but the idea of a sudden self-inflicted collapse does not match the evidence. Instead, Rapa Nui shows how isolation shapes culture. With no outside support, every decision mattered more. Mistakes were harder to recover from. Adaptation had to come from within. The society changed, reorganized, and survived longer than often assumed. The mystery of Easter Island is not just how the statues were built. It is how people endured in such isolation, how belief and cooperation held them together, and how outside contact reshaped their fate so completely.